And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Dark Ozarks.
On YouTube. Exciting. Yes. It's nice to be on YouTube. And for those who are not familiar with Dark Ozarks, well, read the description. But more than that, I've had very little sleep and too much coffee. But essentially, we really have the opportunity to dig into these long format discussions of all sorts of dark and interesting history in relation to the Ozarks and the Ozarks border lands. And we're going to be dealing with a lot of that tonight.
Specifically, Arkansas and Indian Territory during the Civil War and some of the ghost stories that come out of it.
Yes, there are. And I'm excited, of course. I'm in Missouri, only about 14 miles from the Arkansas border.
I'm about 45 miles from the Arkansas border.
Yeah, so. it's pretty close proximity. I love Arkansas. I will say that right out. I love the state. I love visiting there. There's so many locations that are evocative, are beautiful, are fun. I have incredible memories of particularly Northwest Arkansas, although I've been throughout the state. And it is, I would consider regions like the Boston Mountains to be one of the most beautiful regions of the United States.
Definitely. It really is. It's enchanting.
It is. Now, vastly less beautiful if you are on a 120-mile forced march to get to a battle site, and you've got mountain howitzers that you're dragging along with mules, which happens.
Yes. And generally not in issued uniforms or boots. It's whatever you had. And a lot of them actually walked out of their boots.
Yes. I think there's so many aspects of the Civil War in what is classified as the TransMississippi Theater, which is, for the most part, Missouri, Arkansas, modern-day Oklahoma, bits of Kansas, to a large degree. But essentially, and it may get confusing to some people because in the traditional historical sense, we have the Eastern Theater, we have the Western Theater, and then we have the Trans-Mississippi Theater,
which is west of the Western Theater.
Yes, when you get to the ends of the earth, ask for Earl. When you and the far western border of the Western Theater was the Mississippi River.
Yes.
And then, of course, you cross that, and there's, to me, there's two almost contradictory elements from the war. One, that so many of the things that happened out here in the far west of the military engagements were a microcosm of what was happening elsewhere. Things that happened here, really encapsulates the struggle, the gallantry, the immensity of not just of conflict, but of conflict between neighbor, conflict between brother.
Yes.
That it is,
and in some ways under some of the worst conditions, whereas particularly the Eastern Theater was, a lot of it for a good portion of the war was basically Napoleonic tactics.
Yes.
Line up and shoot each other.
As awful as that sounds, it was a contemporary warfare in those senses, whereas the utility, the pragmatism, the necessity to devolve into guerrilla warfare, develop skirmish tactics, was something actually much more akin to modern warfare
much more like Vietnam and some of the Middle Eastern conflicts since, and Afghanistan and so forth, has a lot more in common with the TransMississippi Theater than the TransMississippi Theater does with the rest of the Civil War in some ways.
I agree. It's, to me, it's fascinating. It's also, of course, fascinating because it is just in our literal backyards in some cases, and certainly that's the case in Arkansas. Of course, we were just at Newtonia, the site of two battles in the autumn of 1862 and 1864, respectively. There was a battle in Forsyth, Missouri. There was a battle in Ozarks, Missouri. Of course, one of the most well-known is the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August of 1861. And something that is particularly striking to me, and this starts dealing with some of those question of conflict or contradiction, I would say, not conflict, seeming contradiction. This is at the far end reaches of the theaters, and yet some of the first battles, Carthage being one of them, and some of the first major incidents, the first death of a general, General Lyon at Wilson's Creek, these types of things took place comparatively very early, in some cases extremely early in the war.
Yes, and actually, more battle in 1861. More battles happened in Missouri than anywhere else.
Which is, it's hard to wrap your head around that, and I think it is. There's also statements. Obviously, information moved much more slowly than it does today, but it is a statement in a sudden, one of the first major conflicts in which there were widespread newspapers, photography, telegraph lines, rail. In comparison to previous conflicts, even in American history, and certainly previous conflicts in the world, in comparison, information was moving at an hitherto unconsidered pace.
It really was, and that did affect things. But by the same token, the ruggedness of the country west of the Mississippi, and being fairly sparsely populated outside of a few handful of cities, also made information less available because it literally just wasn't written down as well, or because so much was on the run. And so there was more guessing of what was really going on, even though you had, quote, better information. In this instance, you really didn't. And that's sort of interesting.
It is very interesting to me. And again, we're dealing with these constant sort of sets of contradiction.
Well, and even when you look at the Civil War in Arkansas, you were saying before we went on air, I think you summed it up pretty well.
It as compiling notes, particularly in regards to our episode tonight, and really, just a number of things that jumped out to me. One of them was really the largely I think the best way to put it, with the exception of a handful of wins very early on, Battle of Wilson's Creek, also known as the Battle of Oak Hills by the Confederacy, and the First Battle of Newtonia, which have been August and September of 1861, respectively. The Confederates, as a whole, were plagued with with problems, plagued with severe supply chain problems, and then first of all, and then as the war began to move on, even rather rapidly by 1862, Confederate troops under orders from Confederate States of the CSA, Jefferson Davis, were getting pulled into the Western Theater to bolster Confederate action there. And there was an enormous amount of pushback, sometimes pretty intense, in the sense that, no, we need our troops to defend Arkansas. We need and I do find this interesting, the situation in by the end of the first quarter of 1862, following the Battle of Pea Ridge and the Confederate loss at the Battle of Pea Ridge, that troops began getting transferred into the Western Theater. They began getting transferred east into the Western Theater, across the Mississippi. And as a response to that, the governor of Arkansas forbade that and started rerouting troops as Confederate troops from Indian Territory and Confederate troops from Texas were transiting through Arkansas. They would essentially hijacking them and moving them to Pine Bluff, superseding their essentially national orders in an attempt to bolster protection of Arkansas. To me, that's really fascinating. I think it speaks of a different type of social, to a degree, a social structure and a movement, because in the same situation, when Confederate troops in Missouri began getting the same orders, they, on an individual level, simply stopped complying and went home to protect their families.
Yeah. So, but you have that parallel that we're fighting for the cause, but we're not going to fight for Richmond beyond what makes sense to us.
Correct. And again, I think on both sides, either on a on a state level response with the governor of Arkansas, or on a very personal level of rural family men in places like Wayne County, Missouri, simply saying our patriotism is to our region, or our patriotism is to our family, and that at some level that greater cause is going to break down. Yeah,
very much so. And then with the Indian Territory, a lot of what happened affected Arkansas as well, but so much of that was due to politics from the Indian removal and the allegiances that were developed with the tribes as a process of that.
It is, I think, something that is, and this was a comment that I heard recently, and it was really a question, but it was an incredulousness that there would be Native American groups that would fight on the side of the Confederacy, and I think it is so important that we have to understand that the situation in Indian Territory, and of course what preceded it, which was the situation in Chickasaw country, the Cherokee Nation, back east, level after level of this, that these are individual people groups with their own motivations, their own reasons. We might think of them. I think it's a great disservice to look at quote unquote Indian Territory and see a monolithic block of people that somehow should all do the same thing. And I think there's a great lesson of humanity there, that people do a wide variety of things for a wide variety of reasons. This is a great example of that. And for the individuals, expressing surprise over this, I would wager most of them are unfamiliar with the Creek War, and that gave the Creek and the Cherokee generational reasons to hate each other during the first half of the 19th century.
That's true. Plus, I mean, just a good example, during the Civil War period, you have Chief John Ross, who calculated correctly in the end that the Union would probably win. And so aligned with the Union, although it was not so necessarily based on politics, but spent most of the war actually in Washington, D.C., lobbying for the Cherokee, whereas Wate Stand was on the ground in Indian Territory, promoted to Brigadier General of the Confederacy, and not just as a partisan, but as a Confederate officer, and was the last Confederate general to surrender.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of the controversy and difference of opinions even among, the Cherokee.
It does, and the idea that there were a number of complex, conflicting people groups within the Cherokee and with many other of the tribes. This is a highly complex issue, and interestingly enough, is with much of the Trans-Mississippi Theater being less driven by ideals and more driven by pragmatism.
Very much so, very much so. And it's in that context that the rest of the story is told. And we will be uploading an extended video pre-recorded going over more of that tomorrow. So we appreciate everybody, and we'll be back next week.
And we will also see everybody over on Facebook.